So good morning. My name is Aslı Bali. I teach at the UCLA School of Law here, International Law. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's second panel on prospects for change inside Iran. This panel addresses one of the more pressing concerns about contemporary Iran, namely the prospects for changing the current regime, whether in terms of the specific presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad or in terms of more fundamental change in the nature of the regime itself. We're asking what sort of change might be most likely in these scenarios, and what implications do the current wave of protests in the Arab world have for prospects of change in Iran. We have an exceptionally distinguished panel of presenters here to address this topic today. I will introduce them in the order that they will speak, and then invite them to make their initial presentations for about 10 minutes each. After that, I will follow the same format we had in the first panel of this morning. I will ask each of the presenters a question based on the presentations they've given, create an opportunity for the presenters to engage with one another and their respective presentations, and then open the floor for audience questions. It falls to me to keep our presenters to time and to keep our panel to time. Obviously, this panel is going to be followed by lunch. We are starting a little bit late. We will run to 12:15, and I will do my best to keep us moving so that we can address this very important topic, both interactively amongst the presenters and with the audience. With that, let me turn to introductions. Our first speaker will be Professor Abbas Milani, and again, you have the much longer biographies available to you in the materials. I'm going to only introduce them with their short titles of their current positions and invite you to look at their biographies for more information. Abbas Milani is the Hamid and Christina Moghadam Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University and a consulting professor in the Department of Political Science. In addition, Dr. Milani is a research fellow and co-director of the Iran Democracy Project at the Hoover Institution. Our second speaker is Karim Sajjadpour. Karim Sajjadpour is an associate at the Carnegie Endowment. He joined Carnegie after 4 years as the chief Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group, based in both Washington and Tehran, where he had unprecedented access to interviews with senior Iranian officials and hundreds of Iranian intellectuals, clerics, dissidents, paramilitaries, businessmen, and so forth. And our third and final speaker is Ali Alfone. He is currently a resident fellow for the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. He was a research fellow for the Copenhagen Middle East Research Program previously and a lecturer at the University of Southern Denmark. I'm going to invite Professor Milani to begin our panel, and then we will proceed in order.
Good morning. It is indeed privileged to be talking to this group, particularly because there are many distinguished scholars of Iran. I want to particularly mention Professor Banani, who's here, who built the Iranian Studies program at this university, who's a graduate of Stanford University, and I think a couple of generations of scholars of Iran are his students, including my own sister, specifically, and myself, by learning from him. So I would like to welcome him particularly to the audience and say that it is an honor for me to be with him here. The task that we have been asked to address, that is, what are the prospects of change, is arguably the most difficult part of political and social sciences. It is the most perilous part, predicting the future. But people do it all the time, so I will join the fray. I can say the synopsis of my talk can be summarized in 4 words. Strategically optimistic, tactically pessimistic. Yes, I've been teaching for almost 40 years, but I'm still very bashful. I begin quietly, and then you can't stop me. So what I said was that I think the prospects of change are strategically very good, and tactically in the short run, I think fairly difficult because of the brutality of the regime and a number of other factors that I will try to point to. One of the most important aspects of the prospects of change is the constant situation of crisis that we find the Islamic Republic to be involved in. I noticed a few weeks ago that every time I talk, I begin my talk by saying that this is a particularly fortuitous moment because something major has happened in Iran. Then I realized that every time you talk about Iran, something has happened, and it has been a fortuitous moment. There has been a crisis, and there are two approaches, essentially, to why there are these crises. One is the notion that the regime creates these crises because it survives on crisis. It is a regime that uses the crisis for its own stability. But I have another reading of why there is a crisis constantly, and that is the foundation of this regime is profoundly unstable. The foundation of this regime is based on an incongruent mix of medieval concepts of politics and modern concepts of politics. It is in crisis because this was a democratic revolution in 1979 that was abducted by the clergy, specifically by Ayatollah Khomeini, and from a democratic movement, they succeeded in a very clever way, in different stages, in creating a clerical despotism. And because the power of the democratic movement, the Constitution itself, became a kind of incongruent, both judicially, politically, pragmatically, incongruent mix of these two concepts. You have a certain number of offices that are elected by the people and represent the democratic component, the modern component of this revolution, and you have certain other offices that are not elected by the people. According to the most recent iteration, they're not even elected by the Council of Experts that chose Mr. Khamenei. They now claim that he wasn't elected, but he was discovered, that he is truly a gift of God. And members of the council, all they had to do was, when they find a Buddha, they discover a new Buddha, they discover the new leader. And because he's a gift of God, only God can take him away. No one has the power of oversight. I mean, the new discourse that has been developing, particularly in the last few weeks, and I'll tell you why, is truly remarkable. And to me, it indicates the essential last stage of the complete confiscation of this democratic revolution, in the sense that, as I said, the Constitution was this incongruent mix of these two notions, the democratic notion of popular sovereignty, where there were some elections, limited though they were, controlled by the clergy though they became, particularly after the first couple of years, but there was some semblance that there is a dual basis of power. There was the power of the presidency, and there was the power of the clergy. And for at least 10, 15 years, there has been this discussion within the reform movement, for example, inside Iran. Initially, this was a theory offered by Hajjarian, for example, that the way to create democracy in Iran is gradually, gingerly, cautiously chip away at the power of the clergy, chip away at the power of the unelected spiritual leader, and increase the power of the presidency. That was the strategy that Hajjarian suggested. That was the strategy that the reform movement has basically followed. But now, the people of the most conservative iteration of Velayat Faqih, like Misbah, have the upper hand and are offering a discourse, particularly in the last 2-3 weeks, that basically says this is not a republic, this is an Islamic government, it is the government of God on earth, that all offices, elected or otherwise, receive their legitimacy, not from the vote of the people, but from the acclaim and approval of the Wali Faqih. If he withdraws, then that office absolutely holds no power. This was particularly poignant because Ahmadinejad made his attempt to stand up to Khamenei, and Khamenei's egregious, in my view, constitutionally egregious effort to name a minister where the Constitution basically has no provision for naming a minister this way, when Ahmadinejad tried to stand up to it, this counter-narrative became more and more articulate. So we stand today, I think, at one of the most serious critical moments for this regime. I think Ahmadinejad is literally one step from being impeached. I think if he had made one wrong move, there is overwhelming evidence that they had all the votes lined up, they had everything ready to go, they were going to impeach him last week, and he decided to make a temporary acceptance of defeat. Whether that is going to translate in his humiliation or whether it's going to translate into some kind of a compromise, I don't think we still don't know. Clearly, the office of the presidency has in the process been degraded and humiliated. Clearly, the office of the spiritual leader has been degraded and humiliated because he has ordered, he has issued one of his supposed hukm hukumati, and the president has openly, defiantly not accepted it. He has still not said one word about accepting the Khamenei command. So the notion of standing up to this now, in my view, clerically and judicially weakened office, but politically and militarily strengthened office. This is the paradox. Khamenei becomes every day more weakened as a spiritual leader, but becomes tactically stronger because he has the support of the Revolutionary Guards. But because of the way he has played this hand, he is now virtually completely dependent on the IRGC. His staying in power is dependent on whether the IRGC accepts him or not. These cleavages within the elite, and one could go on and mention many, many more cleavages, including the cleavage between Khamenei and Rafsanjani, the two people who have been partners in crime and in business and in running the school for almost 50 years, the two people who are the true architects of this regime. Rafsanjani, who was, I think, the main architect of making Khamenei the spiritual leader, thinking that Khamenei is going to be a malleable spiritual leader. The two are now on the opposite side. It is a remarkable fact of this 30 years that now every president, with the exception of Khamenei himself, every president of this regime has either been impeached, killed, or is considered as part of the foreign conspiracy. Khatami, Ahmadinejad, Bani Saad, and Raja'i, who was killed. So if you go back even further, it is truly a remarkable fact of Iranian society. If you go back to the period of monarchy, since 1840, every head of a state in Iran has either been killed or has died in disgrace in exile, with the exception of one man, Muzaffareddin Shah, who died on the throne in Iran, and he is the one man who gave up the power of Oriental despotism and accepted the voice of the people. So to me, if you look at this in a historic context, since 1850, not a single head of a state has survived the wrath of the people and has been able to navigate this contradiction that has appeared at the core of this Iranian society. You have a society that is increasingly middle class. You have a society that is increasingly educated. Today, you have a society that has 33 million people who have internet access. You have a society in which the women's movement is one of the most sophisticated, subtle, powerful movements of any Muslim society in the modern period. I think if you look at the strength of this movement, of the women's movement, the depth of it, the theoretical depth of it, the sophistication of it, the relentless of it, all of these things, to me, we speak of a society that has reached the level of maturity that it wants now a voice in power. And since 1840, everyone who has stood on the path of this has done so at their own peril. Now, Mr. Khamenei has brought his, I think, tenure to a position where he is at the complete mercy of the IRGC and the Basij. And these tensions are one of the requirements for the transition to democracy in any society. If you look at the literature on transition to democracy, tensions within the ruling elite is one of the requirements. It is necessary but not sufficient. The other things that are also necessary and together make it sufficient are all, in my view, present in Iranian society. I think the only society in the Middle East, in the Muslim Middle East, that is more ready for democracy, or at least as ready for democracy, as ready for this transition to democracy, is Turkey. And thus, to me, the prospects for change, as I said, strategically are very, very bright. I cannot imagine that a regime based on a medieval notion of legitimacy can survive in 21st century Iran. And the reason for it is that the most important basis for the democratic movement in Iran is not ideology, it's not a political organization, it's not charisma, it is the wish of every simple Iranian to want a job, to want to live, who want to live a life free from state intervention, who want to live a 21st century life. This regime cannot give it. The people simply, not for political demands, by insisting on their individual human rights, are now in virtual opposition to this regime. That, I think, cannot last forever. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to be here. Thanks to UCLA and the Burkle Center for bringing us here. I probably speak on behalf of Abbas and Ali when I say that Westwood is the mothership for us Iranian Americans. And yesterday I broke my own record. It took me less than 45 minutes after I got off the plane to find myself in a kebab restaurant. So that was my own record breaking. When I see Abbas's iPad, I wanted to before I start, provide a book recommendation for all of you. I just got off the plane yesterday from China, actually. I was in China for 10 days. And I was reading a wonderful book by David Brooks, who some of you know as the New York Times columnist. And he has this wonderful book. It's called The Social Animal. And it's about how our unconscious minds, and in many ways drive our behavior, but it's unconscious to us, of course. And he had a very interesting factoid about the fact that people oftentimes gravitate towards professions that resemble their own names. For example, individuals called Dennis more often than others become dentists, which we have to point out to Dennis Ross that he missed his calling in life. And people named Lawrence more often than others become lawyers. And so I was thinking about this in the Iranian context, about, in particular, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And it occurred to me that the word in Farsi and in Arabic, actually, you could say most similar to Mahmoud is actually Majnun, which those of you who don't speak Farsi means crazy. So just as an aside there, and you can come up with your own words about Ayatollah Khamenei. Our task here is to try to portend the prospects for change in Iran. And when I have to make predictions about Iran's future, I commonly rely on this old maxim about dictatorships, about authoritarian regimes. And that is that while these regimes rule, their collapse oftentimes appears inconceivable. And after these regimes have fallen, we look back and say, well, their collapse was inevitable. And I think that very much applies to the Islamic Republic of Iran today, meaning people who live inside of Iran, my friends and relatives who live inside of Iran. For them, it's somewhat inconceivable to think that this regime is on the verge of collapse, because they look around and they say, well, this regime has all the power in its hands. It controls the country's massive oil wealth. When it wants to, it can parade tens of thousands of Basij militiamen out onto the streets. So from up close, the regime looks quite powerful and not on the verge of collapse. But again, when it does eventually collapse, I think there are going to be very few people who say, well, really didn't see that coming. This regime really looked like it was on strong footing, and we thought that the idea of having a 21st century God King really sounded like a good idea. So I do think that this regime's collapse is both inevitable and very unpredictable. And if we were asked to compare a little bit Iran to the other uprisings happening in the Middle East, and if you were to have asked 10 Middle East experts 1 year ago, which of these regimes are most vulnerable to collapse, Egypt, Tunisia, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, I would venture to say that the vast majority of them, if not all 10 of them, would have said that Iran is the most vulnerable regime to collapse. And if you look at the three factors I would argue that played the greatest role in bringing down the Egyptian and Tunisian regimes, there were corruption, repression, and economic malaise, economic stagnation. And if you look at objective metrics, Transparency International, the World Bank, Freedom House, Iran ranks higher than Tunisia and Egypt in all three categories. They have higher levels of unemployment and inflation. They have higher levels of repression, and they have much higher levels of corruption as well. So I would start by saying that this regime, as Abbas very eloquently put it, has some major deficiencies which don't portend it a long future. But as I mentioned, its collapse is very unpredictable. And what I thought I'll focus on very briefly are some of the distinctions between Iran and Tunisia and Egypt, and why the Islamic Republic remains in power while those other regimes have fallen. And I would argue in a way, one advantage that the Islamic Republic has over the Egyptian, the Mubarak regime in Egypt, or the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia, is the fact that, in fact, it's an anti-American regime. It's not allied with the United States. And what I mean by that is that when times are tough and when you're under siege, it's actually much more difficult to be an ally of the United States if you're an authoritarian regime in the Middle East. Because I would argue there's a certain ceiling in terms of the violence you can inflict on your population in order to remain in power. Hosni Mubarak knew that he couldn't do what Gaddafi is doing in Libya, which is bombing his own population and killing thousands, or what Bashar al-Assad is doing now in Syria. Because he's subject to kind of American political scrutiny, American public opinion, by virtue of the fact that he was heavily reliant on US aid and had a very strong alliance with the United States. And I think the Islamic Republic, in some ways, it has an advantage on these pro-American autocracies, and that it's not subject to American political scrutiny. It doesn't have to worry that if it kills en masse, the United States government is going to withhold aid money. So I think first, being an anti-American regime, paradoxically, during times of crisis is advantageous. The second point I would make in distinguishing the Iranian regime from the Tunisian and Egyptian regimes, and perhaps other secular dictatorships throughout the Middle East, is the fact that I lived in Iran for several years, and I don't think this regime has widespread support. And I would compare the breadth of its support to that of, say, the Mubarak regime in Egypt, or say the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia. You could argue approximately 20% or less of society is very supportive of this regime. But what I would argue is that what they lack in terms of the width of their support, they make up for in the depth of their supporters, meaning that those individuals within Iran who support the Islamic Republic are much stronger supporters than, say, the supporters of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, meaning that their support may not be wider. Iran's popular support may not be wider, but I believe it is deeper. The support they do have is deeper than those secular dictatorships, by virtue of the fact that this is an Islamic Republic, which plays to people's religious sensibilities. And when I was living in Tehran and I would interact with members of the Basij militia, for example, they thought they were carrying out the will of God in some cases. This regime somehow appealed to their religious sensibilities. So I think that is a real challenge for the opposition moving forward, that they're up against a group of men who believe that they are killing on God's behalf, and this regime, Ayatollah Khamenei, is somehow the Prophet's representative on earth. Now, I would imagine that Ali is going to make this point as well, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. But another distinction, important distinction between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Egypt and Tunisia is that in Egypt and Tunisia, you eventually saw that the military, the Egyptian-Tunisian military, eventually put nation ahead of regime. They decided that, okay, the nation is above the Mubarak regime or the Ben Ali regime. And in Iran, the challenge you have is that the Islamic Republic of Iran, I should say the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, have kind of become one in the same with the regime. That there's very little distinction now between the Revolutionary Guards and the Islamic Republic of Iran, as opposed to, say, the Egyptian military or the Tunisian military. And I think that's going to be a challenge moving forward as well, that you know, whereas in Egypt they put nation before regime, and you know, others may argue that that's also happening in Egypt as well, where the regime and the nation are becoming one and the same. And Iran is certainly the case, that the Revolutionary Guards fear that if the regime falls, then they would lose their vast power and their economic and political influence as well. Now, the last point I would make, or I should say the second to last point I would make about the distinctions between Iran and Tunisia and Egypt is that we saw in Egypt and Tunisia, for example, that the oppositions in those countries didn't necessarily have clear leadership. In many cases, they didn't have a clear leadership, but they did have a common goal, and that was to remove the dictator in power. And in Iran, not only do they lack a clear leadership, but I would argue that the Iranian opposition lacks a clear goal. You know, for some folks in the opposition, it's reforming the system. I think for the younger foot soldiers of the opposition, it's the entire removal of the system. And I think eventually the opposition in Iran is going to have to reconcile. What is it that they're trying to achieve? What is the common goal they're trying to achieve? And the last point I would simply make about the distinctions, again, between Egypt and Tunisia and Iran is oil, which of course makes a huge difference for Iran. And I would argue it's going to be arguably the single most important variable in determining this regime's future. Kind of a interesting statistic, every $1 increase in the price of oil is $600 million additional annual revenue for Iran. Every $1 increase in the price of oil is $600 million additional annual revenue for Iran. So you could argue paradoxically, because of these uprisings, the risk premium of oil prices has gone up about $10, $20 a barrel, which, if my math is correct, is about $12 billion additional annual revenue for Iran. So, you know, Thomas Friedman once said that if we want to help the green revolution in Iran, we have to have a green revolution in the United States to kind of wean ourselves off of oil. So you know, those of you who drove Hummers to this presentation today, you're on notice. So, you know, moving on to the opposition. You know, I would argue that it's potentially not necessarily a bad thing that the Islamic Republic hasn't yet fallen, hasn't yet collapsed, because I don't think that there is a clear plan yet for the day after its collapse. And this is the problem, the challenge that the Egyptians face, the Tunisians face, and maybe the Syrians and Libyans will eventually face, that there's no clear plan for the day after, just like there wasn't a clear plan for the day after in 1978. But as Abbas says, there's plenty of reasons to be hopeful. This is a young generation in Iran which is post-ideological. They can reconcile being independent, modern, and nationalistic, a challenge which you know, the previous generation of Iranian revolutionaries couldn't reconcile, these three things, being independent, modern, and nationalistic. And Turkey has become a good model for them. Second, if I had any doubts about people's readiness for democracy in Iran, people's political maturity, they were eliminated on June 15, 2009. June 15, 2009 was the day of the largest protest in Iran. Approximately 2 to 3 million people took to the streets. It was a silent protest, no looting, no violence, and I think it's quite remarkable. You know, I wonder if we could have spontaneous protests of 2 to 3 million people in the United States without any looting, without any violence. So if I had any doubts about people's readiness, people's maturity for democracy, they were removed that day. But I would say that moving forward, the opposition has a few tasks which they have to which they have to rectify. The filmmaker Mohsen Makhmalbaf used to say that before the revolution, the people in Iran were like sheep and Khomeini was their shepherd. And he said that now people are no longer sheep, and therefore they don't need a shepherd, they don't need leadership. But I would actually perhaps argue a little bit against that. I think that you still need to have some type of leadership. The opposition needs to have some type of leadership. It's too much to put the onus on these young men and women in the streets. So I think that there has to be a leadership which articulates clear demands for Iran's future. And there's an expression about American politics that American politicians, when they're running for office, they campaign in poetry and they govern in prose. And I think that the Iranian opposition has to think a little bit less about poetry and simply repeating these platitudes about democracy and human rights, and think a little bit more about the prose of opposition, the strategy and the tactics, rather than simply calling for democracy and human rights. And frankly, they have to go after, I would argue, the arteries of the economy, to target the arteries of the economy. Instead of simply asking people to come out in the streets en masse, when they're up against, when it's a movement which espouses democracy and tolerance and nonviolence, it's going to be very difficult to compel these young people to go out in the streets and risk their lives when they're up against these militiamen who are very willing to kill and die. So I think that the opposition will have to do a better job of trying to target the major arteries of the economy, the bazaar, the labor movements, the oil workers. If you remember the US presidential elections in 2008, one of the star protagonists was Joe the plumber. And I tell folks within the opposition in Iran that they have to reach out to Mohammed the plumber in Tehran and kind of make it clear to Mohammed the plumber in Tehran why he would be better off in a green Iran. And I'll just end by saying to kind of reiterate Abbas's positive feelings about the way forward in Iran. And I'm always reminded of a quote from then, I believe it was then Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres. And he was asked about the prospect of the likelihood of a Palestinian-Israeli peace deal. And he said that the good news is that there's light at the end of the tunnel, but the bad news is there's no tunnel. And I think likewise in Iran, the prospect for democracy in Iran, the good news is that there is light at the under the tunnel, but we have to do a better job of creating that tunnel. So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for the invitation, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to share my analysis with you. Unfortunately, I share some of the pessimism that Professor Mirani and my good friend Karim Sajjadpour have expressed. But there is on one point where I slightly disagree. It's not so difficult to predict the future, at least not in the near term in Iran, because the future has already arrived. The Islamic Republic of Iran is very, very fast developing into a military dictatorship. That is the future that we are moving towards very, very fast. This military dictatorship is quite interesting and very, very unprecedented in the history of modern Iran. Even at the era of Reza Shah the Great, founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, we had no military dictatorship of the kind that Iran is going through during these years. Now, let me move back and talk about why Iran is developing into a military dictatorship, and then discuss the consequences of transformation of the Islamic Republic into a military dictatorship. Traditionally, the Islamic Republic, for the past 3 decades, has been a regime in which authority has rested upon a fundamental alliance. That alliance has been between the revolutionary Shia clergy on the one hand and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on the other. There was also a very clear division of labor between the two. The clerics were ruling Iran, while the Revolutionary Guards was traditionally tasked with the job of protecting the regime against internal and external enemies. In other words, the big difference between the Revolutionary Guards and, let's say, the US Army is the very fact that it is an ideological and political army which is asked for and is constitutionally tasked with intervening in the politics of the state, domestic politics, in order to preserve the nature of the regime, the ideological foundations of the regime. Its task is not only to care for and protect territorial integrity of Iran. No, it is also asked to maintain the ideological Islamist nature of the regime. But gradually, the Islamic Republic is developing into a regime where the Revolutionary Guards not only guards the ideological nature of the regime, it is also increasingly ruling the Islamic Republic. And that is what I call a military dictatorship. If you look at American presidents and the presidents in the Islamic Republic of Iran for the past 3 decades, you have many, many great generals and soldiers who become presidents of the United States. In Iran, Mr. Ahmadinejad is the first president in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran who is an ex-army officer of the Revolutionary Guards. Prior to Mr. Ahmadinejad, we had no representative of the Revolutionary Guards in the presidency. If you look at the cabinet over which Mr. Ahmadinejad presides, 12 out of 21 cabinet ministers are former members of the Revolutionary Guards. If you look at the composition of the Islamic Consultative Assembly, the Parliament of Iran, more than half of the members of the Parliament are former officers of the Revolutionary Guards. That is also true of vice ministers. That is true of newspaper editors. That is true of intelligence ministry officials. That is true of business leaders in the Islamic Republic, sociologists, university professors. In other words, membership of the Revolutionary Guards and service during the Iran-Iraq War has become the one single factor elevating individuals to the helm and top of the Islamic Republic. That is the one career move which makes you an elite member in Iran. Statistically, we can prove that the number of former IRGC officers among the political elites and business leaders of the Islamic Republic and many other sources of authority and offices of power in Iran exploded in 1997. Now, in other words, the exact year, we can prove this statistically. The very same year that Mr. Mohammad Khatami was elected into office as President of the Islamic Republic of Iran. At that very moment, the Supreme Leader of Iran and many of his entourage members, they believed that 20 million votes for Mr. Khatami was a vote for change. They began calling Mr. Khatami Ayatollah Gorbachev. What does it mean? Gorbachev, of course, was a devout communist. He did not want to dismantle the Soviet Union. But Mr. Gorbachev started a reform process which ended in the total collapse and dissolution of the Soviet Union. The reforms that he started in Soviet society increased and accelerated public demand for reforms. This is what Ayatollah Khamenei wanted to stop. Therefore, he actively urged former officers of the Revolutionary Guards to intervene in politics in order to create a counterbalance to the reformist demands and reformist political elites rising to power in Iran. But unfortunately, as we all know, when you invite people with guns into office, you can't throw them out again. This is exactly what has happened in Iran. And today, Ayatollah Khamenei is more than ever relying his power on the Revolutionary Guards rather than on legitimacy and will of the Iranian people. The same thing also applies to the economy of the Islamic Republic. If you look at the Tehran Stock Exchange and look at especially the process of privatization of publicly owned enterprises in Iran, the greatest wave of privatization in the history of the Islamic Republic has taken place during the presidency of Mr. Ahmadinejad. During his presidency, $120 million worth of publicly owned enterprises has been privatized through the Tehran Stock Exchange. But privatization everywhere in the world means that you transfer ownership from the state to the private sector. In Iran, it means something else. It means transfer of ownership of publicly owned enterprises from one part of the public sector, which is relatively transparent, into another part of the public sector, which is completely intransparent. More than $60 billion worth of privatization has been privatized to the Revolutionary Guards. And they do not buy stocks the way that, let's say, pension funds of American officers act on New York Stock Exchange. No. For example, during the privatization of Iran Telecommunication, which is the largest trade in the history of Tehran Stock Exchange, $8 billion. 3 companies were competing for ownership of Iran Telecom. 2 of those companies are owned by the Revolutionary Guards. The 3rd company was a genuine private sector representative. But 24 hours before the trade, the Revolutionary Guards vetoed participation of that one single private sector company in the process, arguing that this is a strategic asset which we cannot give to the private sector. It was important for survival of the regime that a Revolutionary Guards company owns Iran Telecom. And needless to say, the 2 Revolutionary Guards-owned companies did not compete with each other for ownership of that company. If you look at developments within Iran's Supreme National Security Council, which is the highest institution for political and strategic decision-making in Iran, you see that the Revolutionary Guards is not pursuing or defending the interests of Iran, but it's pursuing its own corporate interests. Let me give you an example. It would be in the interest of the Islamic Republic to have foreign direct investments in Iran and have foreign companies working in developing Iran's South Pars gas field. That would be in the interest of the state. But because of the sanctions regime, foreign companies are leaving development of the South Pars project, Iran's oil fields and gas fields. Now, just guess who and what types of companies are benefiting from the fact that foreign companies are no longer active in development of Iran's oil and gas sector? The Revolutionary Guards. In other words, the Revolutionary Guards at the meetings of the Supreme National Security Council vote for and adopt very, very radical policies, which again impose and provoke foreign sanctions against Iran, after which the same projects, billions of dollars worth projects, are awarded, are given to the Revolutionary Guards and especially their engineering corps, Khatam al-Anbiya construction base. The Revolutionary Guards is not pursuing the national interest of Iran. The Revolutionary Guards is pursuing its corporate interests. Even in the realm of religion, and that sounds maybe interesting and strange to you, even in the realm of religion and spiritual life of the Islamic Republic, you see Revolutionary Guards' engagement in politics. For example, when Mr. Ahmadinejad for the first time came to this country to address the United Nations General Assembly, returning home to Iran, he had a trip to Qom. And talking with one of the Ayatollahs, Ayatollah Amoli, he said that, well, he experienced a halo of light around his head while addressing the General Assembly. And during that 45 minutes long speech that he made, nobody even blinked. A clear miracle, no? After which Ayatollah Amoli looked at him and says, you know, glory belongs to God alone. And the Ayatollah says this 3 times. I mean, when a cleric says that, it means that I know that you are a liar, your father was a liar, and you have been liars for the past 7 generations. But is Mr. Ahmadinejad crazy? No, he's not Majnun. He's not crazy. He is a master of manipulation. He is trying to create the public image that he alone has access to divinity. In other words, this is the most bizarre case of Protestantism in the history of the world. You no longer need to go to your supreme leader if you want to establish contact with divinity. You can go to your president. This is how the Revolutionary Guards infiltrating all spheres of public life in Iran. And most unfortunately, because of the reasons that we have discussed, especially the disloyalty of the opposition leaders, especially Mr. Mousavi and Mr. Karoubi, towards the cause of democracy in my country, the Revolutionary Guards is bound to rule Iran for some years before we can have a democratic development for which we all pray and hope and work. Thank you.
I think we can all agree that we've had 3 lively, spirited presentations. I'm going to pose a question based on actually the presentations themselves to each of the presenters. in order, and then after we take those comments, that we will open up to the audience. So Professor Milani, I'm actually interested in posing to you a question that is raised by the comments of both Karim Sajjadpour and Ali Alfoneh. You focused in your discussion on the competition between the office of the presidency and that of the supreme leader and what it represents in terms of contestation in the constitutional system. And you brought in a little bit the opposition, who is now an oppositional elite, namely the former president, Rafsanjani, and the ways in which his break from Khamenei may also signal particular kinds of developments within the establishment, elite establishment in Iran. But then you noted that the real source of potential change is actually civil society, and it's the fact that you have a women's movement, that you have a mature set of actors that are seeking a voice, popular sovereignty, and so forth. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about your understanding of the state of the leadership there on that side. So not on the presidency and the supreme leader side, but rather on the civil society side, and particularly picking up where Ali Alfoneh just left off, what do you think of the degree to which either Mousavi, Karoubi, or others still represent a leadership? To what extent the announcement of the creation of the Green Path of Hope, for example, by Mir Hossein Mousavi, it represents any kind of an important development? Or do you agree with Karim Sajjadpour that this is essentially a movement that is both leaderless and without a clear goal? So that would be the question that I would ask you. Karim, you gave us a very, very interesting presentation, and I really appreciated the comparison that you provided with the Arab Democratic Spring, and I agree entirely with you on your assessment of the three factors that affected Tunisia and Egypt. But while I would agree, or I would concede, I'm not sure, I haven't looked at those statistics, that Iran scores much worse on all three of those factors. I'm sure that's very plausible. The last of your points, namely oil, of course, distinguishes it completely from Egypt and Tunisia and makes the question of corruption and economic stagnation quite different. It has very different distributive consequences, and so we wouldn't expect the same path necessarily to occur. And I wonder if instead of that kind of sudden change, whether or not the picture that you've painted for us doesn't rather point in the direction of gradualism. And in fact, you ended there. You ended pretty much by saying it might be a good thing that we haven't seen this kind of fast-paced, accelerating dynamic of change in Iran when there isn't a clear strategy in place. So then I just would wonder, what is the path that you would ideally see? What does that path look like? What might that gradual, in other words, I would say, as between reform and regime change, the two potential goals you might have identified, you would seem to be on the ledger on the side of reform in light of your comments, or at least that's how I've interpreted them. First, is that right? And secondly, if that is right, what does that path look like in your mind, at least in a sketch form? And is there anything, your final point was, we should be doing a better job of providing the tunnel. And I thought to myself, well, there are a lot of we's in this room. There is the Westwood we that you spoke of, the mothership is well represented, I'm sure, here. So you might be speaking of the Iranian diaspora. Or you might be speaking to US policymakers on this question. And how do you see the relationship between whichever we you were addressing with respect to the tunnel, other than domestic factors in Iran, and that reform model that you seem to be advocating for? And finally, Ali, I think that I would like to invite you to think about the comparison that Karim made to the Arab Democratic Spring. What you've described to us is essentially very comparable to what Professor Milani described, but where he finds it to be a source of optimism because he thinks it's a real crisis to see this kind of shift away from religious authority and legitimacy to IRGC dependency on the part of Khamenei and the increasing role of the IRGC. You see consolidation, and I tend to agree with you that the picture you describe, where the IRGC has increasing control both of the economy and of political posts that are important, and now of the presidency, and potentially even the supreme leader's dependency on the IRGC, suggests a moment of regime transformation that, instead of being regime change, is in the direction of greater authoritarianism, consolidation of authoritarianism around a different set of actors who perhaps have a more insidious, in some ways, strategic model of how they're going to guarantee the depth of their authoritarianism through controlling the levers of the economy. But that does make them resemble much more closely a scenario, for example, like Egypt. And here I would depart from Karim's description, where he said the military in Tunisia and Egypt ultimately put nation above regime, and disagree. I think they put their own self-interest above the dictator in order to maintain the regime. So they got rid of Mubarak, and I'll just focus on Egypt. They got rid of Mubarak, but what we're seeing right now is an open question whether what that's going to mean is some kind of move in the direction of democratization, or whether it's going to mean consolidation of military control. And here I don't necessarily mean in the form of military dictatorship. I mean the continued consolidation of economic control of the military in Egypt, coupled with a pliant new coalition or whatever it may be in government that responds to some of the pressure from the West as well as the domestic pressure. So if that's true, and if we were to think of the Arab Democratic Spring as at least potentially a moment of reconsolidation as opposed to genuine regime change, I wonder how you see the comparison then between the prospects we're seeing in the Arab world and the situation in Iran. And I thank you all for engaging my somewhat lengthy questions.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think there is, surprisingly, a large degree of consensus among this very widely desperate, disorganized, spread around the world opposition. There is, I think, consensus on wanting democracy. There is consensus on the view that the concept of velayat faqih in the Constitution, as it is an obstacle to the democracy and the road to democracy. From Rafsanjani in his election bid, when he said to Barbara Slavin that if I become the president, I will curtail the power of Khamenei, to Mousavi, who has all but discreetly suggested that the Constitution needs to be changed. Remember, he lives in Iran. He doesn't want to be openly accused of sedition. But if you read his couple of last declarations, he all but says that that's what we need to do. He says there's no article in the Constitution that is written in the stone. I think everyone who read that, I assume, understood that that meant velayat faqih needs to change. We need to move towards a more inclusive society. And so there is some level of consensus, some profound level of consensus. And I never thought that Mousavi and Karoubi were the actual leaders of this or the creators of this democratic movement. I even didn't think that Khatami was the creator of Iran's civil society. I've always seen it to be the reverse. Khatami, Mousavi, Karoubi, they were the creations of civil society. Once Iran's civil society, if you look at it historically, the minute they have seen an opening, the minute they have seen the possibility of entering into the political fray and bringing pressure on an individual or an institution to make it more democratic, they have done so. They took what Khamenei assumed, we know this by their own admission. They thought that they have the election of Nater-e-Nouri sewn. They thought that Nater-e-Nouri is going to win. They went to Khamenei and said, we have done polling. If we allow Khatami to win, he'll maybe bring 5 to 6 million votes. This will give us some legitimacy. We'll have our guy. We'll have our legitimate election, enlivened election. They did this, and suddenly the civil society jumped in and turned Khatami into the phenomena that he became. Mousavi, very much the same thing. Mousavi was allowed to run, and we have to now go back. Why did they allow Mousavi to run? We know that Khamenei controls this process. We know that if Khamenei doesn't want, nobody gets on the ballot. We also know that Khamenei hated Mousavi. Khamenei tried to move Mousavi as a prime minister when he was the president. Khamenei picked one of his biggest public rows with Khomeini over Mousavi and lost the battle. So there was no love lost between them. Why did they allow it? Because they thought here's a hapless, uncharismatic, private radical during his days. He has a lot to answer for. He'll run and will make the election, our anointed election, more legitimate. The civil society entered and turned Mousavi into the Green Movement. And in that sense, I think the lack of leadership has both been a blessing and a problem. It's been a blessing in the sense that the regime has not been able to eliminate the leadership and thus eliminate the movement. But it has been a handicap because if you have a leadership, it is easier to organize. It is easier to tell the international community what the Iranian democratic movement wants. Right now, there is no one who can tell the international community, for example, what do Iranian Democrats want. Karim and I think we're jointly before the Congress, testifying before the Congress, and one of the representatives said, what do Iranian Democrats want the United States to do? He says, in the case of South Africa, we could go to Desmond Tutu and he would tell us, we want you to put an embargo on this regime, isolate it completely, and this regime will fall. He says, we talk to you people, there is no one to talk to, there is no one. So in that sense, there is I think, a weakness. To me, the movement's leadership is truly, I mean, it sounds rather cliche, but I think it is true. The movement's leadership is non-hierarchical. It is no longer the Leninist model that had been in force for politics in Iran for the last 2-3 centuries, where sort of it's a top-down. This time, it is a bottom-up. It is a kind of an amorphous network rather than a hierarchical leadership. And that's why they want a new, non-utopian, non-violent change. They don't want to create the perfect society. When you want to make change rather than when you want to make perfection, that's when you can create a democratic society. Movements that want to create the perfect future invariably beget totalitarianism. Movements that accept human frailties, accept the limits of the human condition, and just want to make it better for all of us to live better lives rather than becoming the perfect Muslim or the perfect Marxist, the perfect Nazi. Those are the regimes that allow for democracy. And I think we have that in Iran, and we have it in a level of, the discourse that comes out of Iran, the level of sophistication is truly, to me, remarkable. It's much more sophisticated. The democratic discourse coming out of Iran under the current condition of strong censorship is much more sophisticated and nuanced than nearly everything that is produced outside the country. And to me, that indicates that the conditions for that change, although the leadership has not been there, the reality and complexity of that women's movement. Look at what is happening in music. Look at what has happened in the music scene, the underground music scene in Iran. Right now, there is a virtual revolution going on in Tehran in music. We have Namju at Stanford. Look at what is happening in theater. People are putting on theaters in homes. Very much what you read about what was Prague before the revolution is now Tehran in terms of the cultural situation. People are producing films without going through the regime. People are publishing books without going through the regime. They are completely trying, civil society, people are putting exhibitions. They banned an exhibition of a painter. They decided to have it in the private home, and even more people showed up. The first night, to the detriment of the regime and to oppose the regime, all the paintings were sold. So that vibrant, almost subaltern, cultural, political, aesthetic revolution that is happening, to me, is the real source of optimism for future.
Your questions were terrific, Asli, very incisive. And let me be clear by saying that I don't believe this regime is reformable. I don't believe it's redeemable. No, she asked me whether I thought what was the right path. And I think that, a decade ago, 15 years ago, I believe the Islamic Republic had a decision to make, whether they were going to pursue the China route, which was to put pragmatism ahead of ideology, or what I would call the Soviet route, to put ideology ahead of pragmatism. And I think they've very clearly chosen the second route, which is to put ideology at the expense of pragmatism. And so, if I had to guess, my sense is that their decay is going to be gradual, like that of the Soviet Union, kind of a gradual decay, rather than some type of an abrupt revolution like what happened in Egypt in the span of a couple of weeks. And I think that that isn't necessarily a bad thing. And the reason why I say this, of course, if I could push a button right now and have the Islamic Republic collapse, it would be extremely tempting. But the concern here is that the goal shouldn't be simply to have the dictator fall, but the goal should be to have to create some type of a sustainable democracy for the day after. And when I look around at the state of the opposition right now, and when I talk to people both inside and outside the country, my sense is that they're not quite there yet. They still need a little more time to get themselves ready. So that was the point I was trying to make. Some type of a gradual decay may actually be preferable to some type of an abrupt collapse. Now, what complicates everything is, of course, the nuclear clock, because you have kind of two clocks ticking simultaneously, the nuclear clock and, for lack of a better term, the regime change clock. And of course, from the vantage point of the US government and of course, the Israeli government, and I'm sure, many Iranians living here, we would like to see that clock expire right away, the regime change clock. But again, just to emphasize the point, it is a concern that I think we should be more focused on the day after rather than simply removing the dictatorship. And you asked me the question, who is we, when I say that we need to do a better job of trying to create that tunnel toward democracy. Who do I mean by we? I mean it in a very collective sense. I think, we, Iranian Americans, we maybe in kind of the analytical community who are focusing on kind of what paths and which policies which would be most conducive to change in Iran. And we, those of us in the room who are US policymakers or work closely with the US government, because I think that there has been far too much in the form of simply platitudes to say, the regime needs to go and democracy and human rights, which is wonderful. But I think those types of statements need to be unpacked and say, okay, what type of democracy? Federalist democracy, constitutional democracy, parliamentary democracy, some types of ideas about kind of the day after in Iran, and again, how to achieve that goal. And I'll give a concrete example of how I think the US government could be doing a better job. There's a lot of pressure oftentimes on the Obama administration to be more outspoken about condemning Iran's human rights abuses or being more outspokenly supportive of Iran's democracy movement. For me, what I would like to see the US government do, the rhetoric is fine, and the solidarity I think is very important. And the moral clarity is very important. But I think what would be very useful is for not just the US government, but whether it's the US government or European governments or even those in the diaspora, to be more helpful in providing Iranians the tools to fight against the regime. One, I think, very important example is to help to inhibit the regime's monopoly on information and communication. And the specific example I'll give is in the aftermath of the uprisings in 2009, the regime was blocking satellite television, so people had no access to outside news. They were eavesdropping on people's telephone calls and imprisoning people. They were hacking internet accounts. They were shutting down the internet. So there was this kind of media and information embargo imposed on people, which proved to be hugely detrimental. And at that time, there was a 25-year-old kid living in a studio apartment in San Francisco called Austin Heap, who had tried to create this software called Haystack, which would inhibit the regime's ability to filter the internet. And Abbas and I tried to help him out, and ultimately it turned out to be a project which wasn't terribly successful. He was kind of exaggerating what his software could do. But I look back and I say that why should the onus be on a 25-year-old kid living in a studio apartment in San Francisco to fight the Iranian regime's censorship of the internet? We spend billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars trying to fight this regime and undermine this regime. It would seem to me that, whether it's our Iranian-American technologists or, US government or Israeli government, which is incredibly high-tech, there should be more of an effort made to try to provide people the tools to fight this cause for democracy, rather than simply saying, yeah, the Islamic Republic is a dictatorship, we condemn human rights abuses, and we wish democracy for Iran. That's not terribly helpful. And I'll just end on saying that, the point about Egypt and Tunisia, and whether the Egyptian military and Tunisian military put nation ahead of regime, or did they put their own interests ahead of all? And I would just argue it's too early to tell. I think you're right that if we're looking at it right now, it looks like the army in Egypt has simply been strengthened. I'm less sure about Tunisia. But I would simply say, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it'll be more clear what happened there precisely. But certainly in the case of Iran, the Revolutionary Guards and the regime have become indistinguishable from one another. So I thank you.
Thank you. One of the interesting aspects of the Iranian regime, both during the Shah actually, and also during the Islamic Republic, is that both regimes wanted to modernize Iran. His late Imperial Majesty, the Shah, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, even Ayatollah Khamenei, all three had a desire to modernize Iran. We like it or not, they brought about, and enacted policies which led to modernization of Iranian society very, very fast. And of course, under the weight of that hasty and very, very fast modernization program, and opposition grew to the Shah, it was an urban-based, extremely well-educated, well-oriented middle class, Iranian middle class, which demanded to be master of its own destiny. That was, in reality, the product of the reform programs and modernization programs of the Shah. So His late Imperial Majesty wanted to modernize Iran, but he did not desire to democratize the Iranian political system. The Islamic Republic is duplicating the exact mistakes of the Shah's regime. They have tried to modernize the Iranian society, but they deny the right to political participation to the middle class in Iranian society. And therefore, they are facing an opposition movement which wants to get rid of the regime. This is the paradox. The solution that the regime has found to this problem is in reality to create a single party system in Iran, in which the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij is the single party. Just like the Shah tried to create the Rastakhiz, resurgence party. So every middle class person could become a party member and do career within that system. But of course, Iranians were and are more clever than that. They would not want to be a member of that system. And the Rastakhiz party never became a party with very, very deep political roots. I'm sure that in the longer term, I do share the optimism that the politics of modernization and the results it's going to provoke in Iranian society is bound to create insurmountable challenges to the regime. But in the shorter term, unfortunately, the IRGC and the Basij seem to have become the single party, and single party regimes, as we know, are more stable than no party regimes. Until now, the Islamic Republic has more or less been a no party political regime. Let me say a couple of words about the opposition in Iran and compare it with those in Egypt and Tunisia. In Egypt, the opposition, both rank and file members and the leaders, went to the streets demanding ousting of Mubarak. In Iran, Mr. Karoubi and Mr. Mousavi write a letter to the Interior Ministry asking for permission to go out and demonstrate. Did anybody ask Mubarak's Interior Ministry to demonstrate against the regime in Cairo? No, they just went to Tahrir Square. Why don't you do that in Tehran? I don't understand that. When the millions, hundreds of thousands of people were out in the streets in Cairo, the opposition leaders urge the people to stay in the square until they have given their rights that they deserve. In the Iranian case, according to Tehran Mayor Mr. Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf, there were 3 million people in the streets of Tehran. But the opposition leaders, Mr. Karoubi and Mr. Mousavi, urged the people to go home. Why? In the Egyptian case, the opposition leaders knew what they wanted. They wanted democracy. And they said that the Mubarak regime cannot be reformed. In the Iranian case, Mr. Mousavi and Mr. Karoubi, contrary to all experiences that we have seen, all empirical evidence for the past 3 decades long history of the Islamic Republic, are still calling for reforming a system which is fundamentally not reformable. Why? I, unfortunately, am inclined to believe that this leadership is going to decline, and a much more radical opposition will arise from the ashes of the current opposition. And I say that I think it's unfortunate because fundamentally I'm not a very revolutionary person. I don't like revolutions. We have had 2 revolutions in the 20th century and 1 revolution in the 21st century. Nobody knows the consequences of that. But most unfortunately, the Islamic Republic does not give me any chance to believe that this system is reformable. And unfortunately, I also see that this opposition movement is doing such a bad job that a much more radical opposition will arise. Thank you.